The sound of the principal's voice still echoed across the crowded auditorium when she leaned over, her lips brushing my ear with words that ripped the air out of my chest. "I'm leaving you tonight, after this is over. Don't make a scene. Our son deserves this moment." At first I thought I misheard her, but then I turned my head and saw that little smirk she wore when she wanted to twist the knife. The same smirk that had haunted me for months every time she pulled away from me. Every time she suddenly had work late. Every time her phone disappeared under her pillow the second I walked into the room. And there, in the middle of rows filled with proud parents clapping for their kids, she detonated the truth with the precision of a surgeon cutting open a wound, making sure it would bleed in public. I tried to keep my hands from shaking, tried to hold my applause for my son who had just walked across that stage, his face beaming with the kind of pride I hadn't seen in years. My palms stung as I clapped, but my eyes blurred with something that wasn't joy. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stand tall as though her words hadn't gutted me. The irony of it all was brutal. The one day that should have been about celebrating my boy's hard work, his transition into adulthood, his moment of glory, she chose to steal it from me, from him, and twist it into her stage. And the worst part? She knew exactly what she was doing. As the ceremony ended, parents filed out, congratulating one another, snapping photos, hugging their kids, while I stood there with my smile glued to my face like a mask. She leaned into me again, her perfume hitting me like a bitter reminder of every lie she had coated with sweetness. "We'll talk after. Don't embarrass yourself. Or him." The venom in her tone was casual, as though she were simply reminding me to pick up milk on the way home. My son came rushing toward us, his cap in his hand, his eyes sparkling. "Did you see me? I didn't trip. I was so nervous I would." He laughed, and I forced myself to laugh with him, pulling him into a hug so tight I thought I might break his ribs. My wife, though, barely touched his shoulder, just enough for the photo she wanted to post later with some hollow caption like "proud mom moment." In that second, as I held my son, I felt a kind of clarity wash over me that I hadn't known in months. All the suspicion, the late nights, the cold distance, the half-truths, none of it mattered anymore because she had given me the one thing I needed, a clear breaking point. She had declared war, and she thought I'd sit quietly in the trenches while she marched out the front door with her victory flag. But I wasn't going to let her script this story. I wasn't going to let her ruin me and keep smiling as if she hadn't destroyed years of my life. "Dad, can we go eat?" "Everyone's going out to dinner," my son said, tugging at my arm, and I nodded, brushing away every thought except the determination to keep this night about him. But underneath that fatherly smile, something darker was hardening, something that had been quietly building with every unanswered question, every excuse, every hollow glance she had thrown my way. I didn't know the exact shape it would take yet, but I knew this. She had humiliated me on the day that was supposed to be sacred, and I was going to make sure she understood what it felt like to be gutted in front of an audience that mattered. At the restaurant, surrounded by laughter, clinking glasses, and families celebrating, she kept her distance. She smiled at the right moments, laughed when others laughed, but her eyes flicked to me every so often, checking if I would crack, if I would betray the storm that was gathering inside me. I stayed calm, played my role, lifted my glass, toasted my son, and listened to him dream out loud about the future. Meanwhile, she kept shifting in her seat, restless, already halfway out of this family in her mind, eager for whatever plan she thought she had waiting outside these walls. She thought she had all the power. She thought she had silenced me with her whispered announcement in that auditorium. She had no idea that she had just given me the stage I needed to build something far louder, far more unforgettable. That night, when the guests left and the laughter faded, she walked into the bedroom with her suitcase already half-packed. She didn't even flinch when I stepped inside, just zipped the bag with a sharp tug and said, "Don't look at me like that. I deserve better than this life, and you know it." The arrogance in her voice lit something inside me I hadn't felt in years, a fire that burned through the despair she thought she'd left me drowning in. I wanted to shout, to rage, to demand answers, but instead I simply said, with a calmness that startled even me, "You'll get exactly what you deserve." She rolled her eyes, thinking it was an empty threat, and kept packing. But that was the moment I knew the plan was already writing itself, piece by piece, fueled by every ounce of humiliation she had fed me, every drop of bitterness she had poured into my life. I wouldn't let her walk away clean. I wouldn't let her rewrite herself as the hero of this story. I was going to take back the narrative, and when I did, she would finally understand what it felt like to lose everything she thought she controlled. The night after the graduation dinner stretched out like an endless corridor, every tick of the clock on the wall pounding louder than the last, as though it were mocking me with the reminder that time was running out before she disappeared with whatever scraps of dignity she thought she had left. She moved around the bedroom like she was already a guest in a hotel, carefully folding her clothes, stacking shoes, sliding jewelry into the small velvet pouch I had once bought her for an anniversary she now seemed to barely remember. I sat in the corner chair, elbows on my knees, staring at the carpet fibers just to keep from staring at her. Every sound of the zipper, every rustle of fabric into the suitcase, felt like she was peeling the skin off my life layer by layer. She broke the silence first, because of course she had to be the one controlling the scene. It's pathetic, you sitting there like a wounded dog, pretending this wasn't coming for years. You and I both know this marriage died long before tonight, and I don't owe you an apology for finally choosing myself. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried the sharpness of someone who had rehearsed this speech for months, maybe even years, waiting for the moment she could finally deliver it. I lifted my head slowly, not with anger, but with a clarity that surprised me. You chose yourself the moment you decided secrets mattered more than family. Don't pretend this is liberation. This is cowardice dressed up as self-love. She froze for a second, her hands hovering above the suitcase as though my words had brushed a nerve she didn't want touched. Then she forced a smile, tight and venomous. You're angry because you never saw it coming. You thought I would just keep waiting, keep being quiet, keep being your wife in name only while you drifted through life. I'm done waiting. The rage that surged in me then wasn't the wild, explosive kind that makes people reckless. It was quieter, heavier, like molten iron settling deep into my bones. For months, I had let myself wonder if I was imagining things, if the late nights were real, if the sudden coldness was in my head, if the guarded phone and half-hearted intimacy were just phases. I had gaslighted myself into believing I was paranoid, that she still cared, that maybe if I just worked harder, tried harder, she would meet me halfway. But in that bedroom, with her suitcase gaping open like a mouth swallowing our life whole, I realized the truth. She had already left me long ago, and tonight was just her victory lap. What cut the deepest wasn't the betrayal itself, it was her timing. She had stood beside me in that auditorium, our son walking across the stage, and she had chosen that exact moment to stick the knife in, as though my humiliation were part of her celebration. That choice revealed something I couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about her leaving. It was about her winning. She wanted to shatter me publicly, to make sure I carried that moment like a scar carved into the most important day of my child's life. And that was when the last thread inside me snapped. I stood up from the chair, and for the first time that night, my voice didn't tremble. If you wanted to leave, you could have done it any day, any hour, any quiet corner of our life. But you picked tonight, in front of him, in front of everyone. You didn't want freedom, you wanted a stage. So let me promise you this, the performance isn't over. Not yet. She laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was the brittle kind people use when they're caught off guard. Stop being dramatic. You'll survive. You always do. You'll wallow for a while, then you'll move on. Don't try to play the victim here. She zipped the suitcase closed, snapped the lock, and looked at me like I was already history. But what she didn't see was the storm settling into place inside me, the kind that doesn't pass with time but builds, carefully, deliberately, until it finds the perfect moment to strike. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to her steady breathing beside me, the audacity of her slipping under the same covers as though she hadn't just announced the funeral of our marriage hours earlier. I stared at the ceiling, memorizing every shadow cast by the streetlight through the blinds, every creak of the house settling, every shallow inhale of hers. And in that silence I made myself a vow. I would not beg her to stay. I would not fight her lover if there was one. I would not let her walk away untouched. I would make her regret choosing cruelty over honesty, humiliation over dignity. By morning, I no longer felt like the broken man she thought she had crushed. I felt sharper, like every nerve was alive, Every detail suddenly mattered. When she stepped into the kitchen, her suitcase by the door, her hair perfectly brushed as if she were off to a business trip, she didn't even look at me. She poured herself coffee, checked her phone, and said casually, "I'll be back later this week for the rest. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I set my mug down with deliberate calm, watching her scroll through her messages, her smile flickering at something I wasn't supposed to see. And in that flicker, I finally understood. She wasn't leaving for herself. She was leaving for someone else. The text on her screen, the nervous little glance at the door, the way her hand twitched near the suitcase handle, it all told me more than words ever could. And suddenly, I wasn't afraid anymore. Because if she thought she could script my downfall, then she had underestimated me in the worst way possible. That was the exact breaking point. Not her betrayal, not her arrogance, not even the suitcase by the door. It was the realization that she believed I was powerless, that I would simply fade into the background while she stepped into her new life. That assumption was her biggest mistake. The house felt like a stage after she left that morning, her suitcase rolling across the wooden floor and out the door with the sharp finality of a slammed book. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the half-empty coffee mug she had abandoned on the counter, and I let the bitterness in the cup mirror the bitterness inside me. It would have been easy to fall apart, to let anger consume me and lash out with shouting, accusations, or public scenes. But that would have been exactly what she expected, a man unraveling, easy to dismiss, easy to point at and say, "See, this is why I had to leave him." No, I wasn't going to hand her the satisfaction of chaos. My revenge had to be precise, deliberate, and so quiet at first that she wouldn't even see it forming until it was too late. I began with observation, because knowledge was the only real weapon I had. I paid attention to the patterns she thought I never noticed. The sudden evenings out, always labeled as work dinners, but her perfume stronger than usual when she returned. The way her phone never left her hand anymore, even when she stepped into the bathroom to brush her teeth. The quick smile she tried to hide when a notification flashed across the screen. I didn't confront her, not once. Instead, I acted as though I was blind, as though she could keep slipping further into her lies while I quietly traced their outline in the shadows. At work, I kept my head down, but every break was spent making quiet calls, learning what I needed. I called an old friend who ran a small security business and asked about discreet services. Nothing invasive, nothing illegal, just enough to confirm what I already suspected. Within a week, I had the evidence I needed. Photos of her walking hand in hand with a man I had never met, stepping into his car with the same bright smile she had once reserved for me, checking into a hotel with him while texting me some excuse about late meetings. My chest burned when I saw those pictures, but instead of exploding, I felt a strange kind of relief. The truth was finally in my hands, undeniable, solid. She had chosen him, and now she believed she held all the cards. The plan came together slowly, like a puzzle whose pieces had been sitting on the table all along. She wanted to leave me humiliated, to tear down the image of our family in front of others, to rewrite herself as the one who deserved sympathy. So my revenge would hinge on flipping her script, on showing everyone the side of her she thought she could keep hidden. I didn't want violence. I didn't want chaos. I wanted her to choke on the image she had crafted, to watch it crumble in front of the same audience she had tried to impress. I began gathering everything. Bank statements she thought I didn't check, joint accounts she assumed I ignored, receipts she left in her purse without a second thought. Slowly, a trail formed, not just of her betrayal, but of the way she had funded her secret life. Dinners, gifts, hotel rooms, all of it paid from the very accounts we were supposed to be using for our son's future. That was the crack in her armor I had been waiting for. She hadn't just betrayed me. She had betrayed him too, siphoning away what was meant to build his life after graduation. That detail was going to be my cornerstone. Every night, I rehearsed the conversations I would have, not with her, but with the people who mattered most, family, friends, even our son. I imagined their faces when the truth came out, not from my bitter words, but from cold, undeniable evidence. She wanted me silenced with shame, but instead I would turn her arrogance into the very rope that hung her image. And I would do it calmly, without raising my voice, without breaking a sweat, the way she least expected. The trick was patience. I couldn't act right away, no matter how badly I wanted to. She had to feel safe first, had to believe I had accepted my role as the abandoned husband, licking his wounds in silence. So I smiled when she called with casual excuses, nodded when she said she'd be away a few days, even texted back polite responses as though I had surrendered. All the while, I built my case piece by piece, saving photos, bank records, and text screenshots into a hidden folder. I wasn't rushing toward revenge. I was constructing it brick by brick, making sure that when it landed, there would be no escape, no denial, no rewriting. One night, as I sat at the kitchen table with papers spread in front of me, my son walked in unexpectedly. He looked at me curiously, sensing something heavy in the air. "Dad, are you okay?" he asked. I forced a smile, ruffling his hair. "I'm fine, just sorting things out. Don't worry." But in his eyes, I saw the reason I had to follow through. This wasn't just about me being betrayed as a husband. It was about him being betrayed as a son. She had chosen selfishness over his future, and I would not let that go unanswered. By the end of the second week, I knew exactly how it would unfold. The moment would come when she least expected it, when she felt comfortable enough to gloat, to believe she had walked away clean. That was when I would reveal everything, not in rage, but in calm, deliberate precision. And when it happened, the very people she thought would support her would see her for what she was. The performance wasn't over. In fact, the real show hadn't even begun. The hardest part of revenge isn't the planning, it's the waiting. Every day she stayed away. Every night she sent vague texts about being busy. Every hour she thought I was shrinking into silence only sharpened my patience. I knew if I moved too soon, I'd look like the bitter husband grasping for dignity. But if I waited long enough, her own arrogance would dig the hole for me. So I stayed calm, played my role, and quietly positioned each piece where it needed to be. I started with her family. Not directly, not with accusations, that would have tipped my hand, but with careful conversations sprinkled like seeds. Over Sunday dinner with her parents, I casually mentioned how she seemed so busy these days, how I barely saw her, how she had withdrawn from both of us since our son's graduation. I made my tone weary but never bitter, letting them fill in the gaps themselves. Her mother frowned. Her father shifted uncomfortably, and I knew the thought had been planted. When she came around later with her usual bright smile, they'd be watching more closely, and every inconsistency would do the work for me. Next came the finances. Quietly, methodically, I moved money from joint accounts into one that only my son and I controlled. Nothing suspicious, nothing reckless, just enough that when the time came, she wouldn't have the resources to spin the story in her favor. I left just enough in the shared accounts to keep her comfortable, to let her believe nothing had changed, while I tucked away the evidence of her withdrawals and frivolous spending. Every receipt became a brick in the wall I was building around her, a wall she wouldn't see until it closed in. But the real tension built when I rehearsed the confrontation in my mind. I pictured her face when the evidence landed in her lap, when the audience she had tried to impress with her independence saw the truth of her betrayal. I didn't imagine yelling or slamming doors. I imagined quiet, surgical precision, the kind of exposure she could never recover from. That thought kept me steady, even when the temptation to snap at her grew unbearable. One night she called me, her voice sickeningly sweet, asking if I could cover for her at some family event because she had to work late. I could hear the muffled laughter of someone in the background, and I clenched my fist so tightly my nails bit into my palm. But instead of confronting her, I said warmly, "Of course, don't worry. I'll take care of it." She hung up, convinced I was still blind, and that moment solidified my resolve. Her lies weren't just insults anymore, they were fuel. The next day, I invited her sister over under the pretense of needing help organizing things for our son's college applications. As we sorted papers, I let a few bank statements accidentally slip from the pile. She noticed the charges, dinners, hotels, gifts, and her eyebrows shot up. I acted flustered, tried to cover it, then sighed as though I were too tired to fight anymore. "I don't know what's happening, but I can't stop it," I murmured. She didn't press further, but I could see the gears turning in her head. That was exactly what I wanted, suspicion spreading quietly, like smoke before a fire. Meanwhile, I kept my son close. I didn't poison him against her. He deserved better than to be caught in the crossfire, but I made sure he saw my consistency. I was there for dinner, for late-night talks about his future, For every small moment, she was too distracted to notice. The contrast painted itself naturally, no words needed. Where she was absent, I was present. Where she was careless, I was steady. And slowly, he began to sense the imbalance without me ever saying a thing. The final piece of the build-up came with an opportunity one couldn't have scripted better if I tried. Our son's college acceptance letter arrived, and he wanted to celebrate with both of us. She, of course, agreed with enthusiasm, pretending nothing was wrong. She suggested a family dinner, the three of us together, as though she hadn't been dismantling us piece by piece for months. I smiled, agreed, and marked the date in my mind as the perfect stage for the first act of her unraveling. I spent the days leading up to it preparing every detail. Copies of receipts, photos neatly printed, statements organized, all tucked into a folder I kept hidden in the study. I didn't plan to dump everything at once. No, that would be too messy. Instead, I would let it unfold like a story, each page exposing more of who she really was, each detail impossible to deny. She had humiliated me at our son's graduation, the day meant to honor his future. Now I would use his next milestone, the moment he officially stepped into adulthood, to show her what it felt like to be stripped bare in front of the people who mattered most. As the night of the dinner approached, I felt no fear, only a calm, deliberate readiness, like a performer waiting behind the curtain, knowing every line, every cue, every gesture that would land exactly as intended. She thought the stage belonged to her, but soon she would realize I had rewritten the script, and this time, she wasn't the director, she was the tragedy. The restaurant she picked had soft lighting and framed black and white photos meant to make ordinary people feel important. And as we sat at a corner table with our son between us, I could feel the careful choreography she wanted to direct, because she began with a syrupy toast about new beginnings and proud parents and the beauty of change, while I let the words float like soap bubbles that looked pretty for a breath and then burst into nothing. And when the waiter left our drinks and the menus became a small barrier on the table, I leaned forward and told our son that acceptance letters deserved honesty more than pleasantries, because the future he had worked for needed clean ground to stand on. And he gave me that searching look that children wear when they sense that the story they believed about their home might be missing a few essential pages. She tried to jump in with an eager grin and asked him about dorms and majors, and whether he had decided on the laptop he wanted, and she filled the space with questions that sounded like love, but felt like fog. So I reached for the envelope I had slid into my jacket before we left, and I placed it beside his water glass without flourish, telling him quietly that grown-ups sometimes make mistakes that spill past the edges of their marriage and land on the people they were supposed to protect, and that when money and time and trust are taken from the place where a child's life is being built, truth becomes an obligation, not an option. And he nodded slowly, as though bracing for a wave. She laughed then, the brittle kind that asks the room to agree with it, and said this was not the night for dramatics and that I was determined to ruin celebrations out of habit, which was when I slid the first page out and turned it toward our son, a simple statement with a set of dates and totals that meant little on its own. So I spoke gently about joint accounts and budgets, and the savings we had promised would follow him into college, and I traced a finger down the column of charges that match dates when she had said she was working late and I had believed her, and I told him that every dinner and hotel and gift was not just a betrayal of vows, but a subtraction from the fund that was supposed to carry him without fear, and his eyes moved between us with a confusion so raw that I felt the urge to soften it and hide it. Yet I knew that protection without truth would only prolong the wound. She reached for the paper with a flash of anger that tried to pass for indignation and delivered a speech about pressure and loneliness and how she had carried a household with an unappreciated strength that no one recognized. And she said the expenses were misunderstandings and the hotel charges were part of a conference package and that I was twisting numbers because I wanted control, but I had come prepared for the script she loved. So I opened the second sleeve and slid out the printed photos I had never wanted to own. And I did not throw them like weapons, and I did not shove them across the plates. I simply placed them in a neat stack and told our son he deserved to know why his father had moved money out of reach and why his parents would not be sharing a home by the time he packed for campus. And I asked him to look only if he felt he needed to, because I would not carve images into his mind he could never unsee. He stared at the stack and then at her, and his mouth trembled in that slow way that happens when a boy realizes the grown-ups are not anchors but sometimes storms, and she lunged into a long justification about feeling invisible and needing to breathe and discovering that her heart could still feel alive. And she said she had planned to tell us after the graduation because she did not want to ruin the ceremony. And I let her finish because interruption would have let her claim I silenced her. And when she ran out of words, I told our son that the timing had never been about mercy. It had been about spectacle, and that people who choose spectacle will always underestimate the quiet person who refuses to perform their assigned humiliation. And I watched the moment he understood that honesty does not always raise its voice. The waiter arrived with plates and an apology for the delay that felt almost comic against the ruin sitting between the bread and the butter, and once he left I spoke carefully, explaining that I had shifted the remainder of the college fund into an account that protected it from misuse, and that the records in the folder would be shared with the people who needed to see them, including her parents and the attorney who would draft the separation so that sentiment could not smear numbers. And she hissed that I was vindictive and petty and small, then leaned toward our son with a plea that sounded like a lullaby sung too late, telling him that love can be complicated and sometimes adults stumble, and she asked him to remember the good years and to not let this define her. He did not yell, and he did not cry. He asked her instead, in a voice that broke only once, whether the dinners and the hotel nights had been paid for with the card that we used when we talked about books and meal plans and the deposit for housing. And when she hesitated, he closed his eyes in the kind of slow blink that feels heavier than tears, while I told him that the account was now safe and that his future would not be bartered for anyone's excitement. And I said this not as a triumphant declaration, but as a promise in a room that smelled like rosemary and expensive wine, and he nodded again, older than he had been when we walked in. She tried to pivot, because control was a habit for her. So she announced that this circus should not continue in public and that I would regret turning our private grief into a spectacle, and I answered with the same steady tone I had rehearsed in the quiet of the kitchen, explaining that I had not raised my voice and I had not flung accusations and I had not performed anything except transparency, and that the only spectacle here was the bill she had charged to our son's future, and I told her that the documents would be delivered to the people who mattered because accountability is not cruelty when someone has chosen to spend trust like a limitless credit line. When the check arrived, I paid without ceremony, and as we stood, I handed our son the envelope and told him to keep it closed unless he needed it for understanding. And I told her that tomorrow at noon she would meet me at the house to collect what she could list and prove belonged distinctly to her, because the rest would be itemized for the attorney. And she opened her mouth to make a scene, but saw in our son's face that the stage had collapsed. So she swallowed the performance she craved and walked out ahead of us with a stiffness that looked like pride until you watched the shoulders and saw the flinch in each step. In the parking lot, the evening air felt colder than it should have in early summer, and my son stood with his hands deep in his pockets and asked in a long, unbroken breath whether this meant holidays would be divided, and whether he had to choose sides, and whether he could still call her when he needed something. And I told him that he would never have to choose between love and truth, and that phones do not burn bridges, but people sometimes do. And I promised him that his life would not be measured by our failures, but by the steadiness we restored now. And he nodded again, quieter, and climbed into the car as though the seat had become a raft. Driving home, I felt no thrill and no triumph, only the grounded certainty that the first act had landed exactly as it needed to, because the audience that mattered had seen what was real without me poisoning their view with fury. And when we pulled into the driveway with the porch light glowing the way it always had, I understood that revenge done properly does not explode. It settles, and it keeps settling. And it waits for tomorrow at noon when the next turn of the blade will not be wild but guided, not loud but unforgettable. The next morning carried a silence so dense it pressed against the windows, and even the birds outside seemed to hesitate before singing, as though the house itself demanded stillness before the second act began. My son had left early to meet friends, his footsteps cautious down the hallway, his eyes avoiding mine as though looking directly would reopen wounds that were still raw from the night before. I let him go without pressing for words, because some truths don't need discussion in the moment. They simply need space to settle. I brewed coffee with a steadiness that surprised me. No shaking hands, no churning stomach, just the deliberate rhythm of spoon, filter, and boiling water, and I realized that revenge had already shifted something inside me. It wasn't about rage anymore. It was about control, about taking back the ground she thought she had burned beyond repair. I poured the dark liquid into a cup and sat at the kitchen table, where papers were still stacked in neat order from my late-night review. Everything ready for noon, when she would walk back into this house not as my wife, but as a guest collecting remnants. When the clock finally crept past 11, I found myself listening for the familiar crunch of tires on gravel, the way she used to arrive home from errands or visits. Except this time it wasn't home she was returning to. It was evidence, confrontation, consequence. At 11:45 I heard it, the low roll of her car pulling up, and I straightened the folders on the table one last time, not for dramatic effect, but because precision mattered, because every detail communicated what words sometimes could not. She entered with that same mix of defiance and discomfort, dragging behind her a second suitcase, as though she intended to pack a new life out of old furniture. "Let's just get this over with," she said, her tone sharp but hollow, like a knife that had dulled from too much careless use. I gestured toward the table, where the lists lay waiting, and explained calmly that the attorney had advised a clear itemization of property, that everything she could prove was hers would be separated today, and the rest would remain for division later. She scoffed, muttering about control and theatrics, but she sat, because sitting meant acknowledging the rules had shifted. We went through items one by one: clothing, jewelry, electronics. She claimed more than she had any right to, and I let her, because the material didn't matter, not compared to what was still to come. Halfway through, she finally snapped, slamming her pen down and accusing me of orchestrating a scene, of turning her family against her, of poisoning our son's view. Her voice rose, but mine didn't. I told her that all I had done was place the truth where it belonged, that hiding evidence wasn't loyalty, and that lies tend to collapse under their own weight when given enough time. Her anger broke into pleading then, the pendulum swing I had expected. She leaned forward, her eyes shining with a desperation that almost looked like sincerity, whispering about mistakes and second chances, about how people falter and rebuild, and she said we could shield our son from the worst of it if I just agreed to keep things private. I studied her face for a long moment and then asked her, in a voice that carried no tremor, why she hadn't thought about shielding him when she drained the account meant for his future, why she hadn't thought about second chances when she timed her announcement to coincide with his graduation. She had no answer, only silence, and in that silence the room itself seemed to shift powerfully in my favor. When the clock struck 1, she packed the suitcase with the items she'd set aside, each fold and zipper louder than her words now, and I could see her posture change, shoulders heavy, hands less steady, because for the first time she wasn't dictating the terms. At the doorway, she paused, suitcase in hand, and turned back with eyes that burned more with frustration than sorrow. "You think you've won," she spat, "but all you've done is ruin what little respect anyone might have left for you." I stepped closer, my voice low but unyielding. "No, what I've done is refuse to let you ruin me on your terms. You wanted a stage, you wanted an audience. Now you've got one, but the story isn't yours to tell anymore. It's mine, and it's his, and it's carved in records no one can deny." She shook her head, muttering something under her breath, and rolled the suitcase out the door. The sound of the wheels on the porch boards echoed like punctuation at the end of a chapter. As I watched her car disappear down the street, I felt no thrill of victory, only the deep settling weight of resolution. Revenge wasn't fireworks or explosions. It was the quiet reclamation of dignity, the slow turning of the knife she had thought she wielded alone. And though the story wasn't finished, though there would be courts and conversations and more moments of reckoning, I knew that the balance had already shifted. The breaking point had passed. The plan had begun. The execution was unfolding. And she, for the first time, wasn't in control. The aftermath didn't roar in like a storm. It crept, slow and steady, spreading through whispers and side glances, carried from one conversation to another like smoke curling under doors until every corner of her world smelled of it. The first shift came from her parents, because within days I received a call from her mother, the kind of call heavy with pauses, her voice cracking as she asked whether it was true that their daughter had been using the college fund for hotel rooms and dinners. I didn't answer with venom. I didn't embellish. I simply confirmed and told her I had the records if she wished to see them. There was silence on the other end, then a broken sigh that sounded more like grief than anger. She thanked me, voice trembling, and hung up, leaving me to imagine the conversation that would follow in their house. By the following weekend, I saw her brother at the grocery store, a man who had always been quick to dismiss me with smirks and jokes about how I could never keep up with his sister. But this time, his eyes didn't carry mockery. They carried something like disappointment aimed not at me, but at her. He stopped me near the dairy aisle, cleared his throat, and said carefully, "I don't know what happened between you two, but she shouldn't have touched his money. That wasn't hers to spend." I nodded, grateful that he'd named the betrayal clearly, and I could see that even if he hadn't wanted to take sides, the facts left him no choice. Word spread further than family. Mutual friends who had once filled our social calendar began drifting toward me, reaching out with cautious texts and messages that all sounded the same. "I don't know what to say, but I'm sorry." One couple invited me to dinner without extending the same courtesy to her, and I realized in those small gestures that her carefully crafted image was unraveling not because I screamed the truth from rooftops, but because I laid it out quietly where it could not be denied. The evidence spoke louder than anger ever could. Her response, of course, was denial mixed with desperation. She sent long, rambling messages late at night, accusing me of manipulating her family, of twisting facts, of planting stories to make her look like a villain. The tone shifted back and forth, one message dripping with fury, the next pleading for understanding, the one after that threatening legal retaliation. I didn't answer a single one. My silence was more powerful than any argument, because she was used to me defending myself, and now there was nothing for her to push against. The true weight of consequence landed during a family gathering we both attended weeks later, a celebration for her niece's birthday. She walked in dressed impeccably, her smile plastered on like armor, but the room did not welcome her the way it used to. Conversations stuttered when she approached, eyes flicked away quickly, and though no one confronted her outright, the distance was palpable. When she tried to make a cheerful toast for the little girl, her voice trembled, and the silence afterward was heavier than any applause could have been. I sat quietly at the far end of the table, not gloating, not even meeting her eyes, just letting the room reflect back to her what she had created. My son, though, was the sharpest mirror. He became polite with her, distant in a way that was almost clinical, answering her questions with the kind of brevity he had once reserved for strangers. She noticed, of course, and tried to win him back with gifts and promises. But the fracture was already there, and she couldn't plaster over it with shallow gestures. One night he came to me, his voice low, and said, "I don't hate her, but I can't look at her the same anymore." I told him he didn't need to hate. That hate was just another leash, but that boundaries were his right. He nodded, and though his eyes were sad, they were clear, and I knew that clarity was its own form of revenge, herself reflected through her child's disappointment. Financially, the consequences deepened as the attorney sifted through records. She was ordered to repay a portion of what she had taken, not because I demanded vengeance, but because the law recognized theft even when it came wrapped in wedding vows. She tried to contest it, her lawyer pushing for sympathy, but the documents were unyielding. Every receipt, every statement, every timestamp painted a picture that no words could blur. Watching her sit across from me in that sterile conference room, her hands clenched, her lawyer's voice faltering against the undeniable, I realized that revenge sometimes looks like justice wearing a simple suit. The quiet fallout extended even to the man she had chosen. I never confronted him, never needed to, but word traveled, and from what I heard, his interest waned quickly once her world began to shrink. The allure of sneaking around behind her family's back dissolved when faced with the reality of being tied to her disgrace. By the time she realized he was distancing himself, it was too late to rewrite the story. Her humiliation had already been stamped into every corner of her life. Through it all, I stayed steady. I didn't raise my voice, didn't chase her down, didn't broadcast beyond what was necessary. My revenge wasn't fire. It was erosion, slow and unstoppable, the kind that eats away until the ground beneath you collapses. And as I watched the pieces of her image crumble, I felt no joy. Only a strange peace. The truth had done the work. She had wanted me to be the spectacle, the one falling apart. Instead, She became the cautionary tale whispered in rooms where I didn't even stand. It began subtly, as these things always do, with the small cracks that spread into fissures before anyone realizes the foundation is slipping. She still tried to present herself as composed in public, but the edges frayed quickly. At work, she had always been known for her bright energy, her ability to smooth over tensions with a smile, but whispers trickled back to me that she was snapping at colleagues, arriving late, leaving early, making careless mistakes that once would have horrified her perfectionist pride. She wasn't the same polished woman who had once walked into rooms expecting to be admired. She was distracted, jittery, her phone clutched like a lifeline she knew would never ring the way it used to. I noticed the first visible collapse at the grocery store. She was in the aisle ahead of me, though she didn't notice until she turned and saw me. She froze for a heartbeat, and I saw how her shoulders slumped before she quickly straightened, forcing a smile that never reached her eyes. There were dark circles beneath them, the kind that no makeup could conceal, and her voice had a tremor when she said, "I didn't expect to see you here." I replied evenly, "It's a small town. We were bound to cross paths." The conversation lasted barely 2 minutes, yet it felt like hours of unspoken weight pressing down. She tried to reclaim her old superiority, warning me that airing dirty laundry had consequences, but the words didn't land the way they used to. They sounded tired, rehearsed, stripped of power. When she turned away, I noticed her hands shaking as she reached for a box on the shelf. Her collapse grew sharper during family gatherings. Once, she had been the center of attention, quick with stories, laughter spilling easily, but now her attempts felt forced, desperate. At her cousin's engagement party, she tried to speak over others, raising her voice too brightly, inserting jokes that fell flat. I sat in the corner, sipping quietly, not feeding her collapse, but not rescuing her either. She glanced at me several times, eyes almost pleading, as though she wanted me to throw her a lifeline, to remind the room of who she once was. I gave her nothing. She had orchestrated my humiliation months earlier. Now she was alone on the stage she had built, and the silence of the crowd was louder than any mockery could be. The man she had clung to vanished entirely. Through quiet channels, I learned he had cut ties, deleting photos, blocking her number, leaving her with nothing but fragments of promises that dissolved once consequences touched reality. She had gambled her stability on him, sacrificing family and dignity, and he had slipped away the second the shine wore off. That abandonment was not my doing. It was hers, but watching it unfold felt like the final twist of a knife she had once tried to wield against me. My son observed her unraveling with a mixture of sadness and detachment. He no longer sought her approval, no longer rushed to share news with her first. Instead, he brought everything to me: test results, campus updates, late-night worries. One evening, after she had called and left him a voicemail begging to see him, he sat at the table and asked, "Do you think she'll ever change?" I looked at him carefully and said, "People can change, but sometimes they don't choose to. And if they don't, then we change how close we stand to them." He nodded slowly, absorbing it not as bitterness but as truth, and I realized that my revenge was no longer about her at all. It was about building something steady for him, proving that betrayal didn't have to define our lives. In private, I often reflected on how the satisfaction I thought I'd feel never came in the form I imagined. There was no triumphant moment, no eruption of joy as she stumbled. Instead, there was a quieter sense of balance, like scales finally tipping back into place. She had stripped me of pride at our son's graduation, turned my humiliation into her showpiece, and now she bore that same weight, exposed not by my shouting, but by her own choices unraveling. Revenge hadn't made me lighter. It had made me anchored, rooted in the knowledge that dignity could be reclaimed piece by piece. Late at night, I sometimes sat alone with the folders still tucked in my drawer, the records, the photos, the undeniable evidence. I no longer needed them, yet I kept them, not as weapons but as reminders. They reminded me that silence is not weakness, that patience can carve deeper wounds than rage, and that the truth, once unveiled, doesn't fade back into darkness. When I thought about her now, I didn't feel anger. I felt a strange pity, watching her stumble through the ashes of her own fire. And yet, there was one part of me that remained unsettled. I wondered if she understood, deep down, that this was never about revenge alone. It was about reclaiming respect in front of the son who mattered more than anything. She had tried to make me small in his eyes, to strip me of worth on a day meant for celebration. Instead, she had diminished herself, and I had stood taller not by shouting, but by refusing to collapse. That was the truest revenge of all, not destroying her life, but refusing to let her destroy mine. Life after the storm didn't return to what it had been before. It reshaped itself into something quieter, steadier, and more deliberate. The house, once filled with the tension of hidden lies and unanswered questions, now carried a calm that felt almost foreign at first. Mornings became simple again. The kettle whistling, the clatter of my son's footsteps as he rushed to get ready, the sound of our conversations drifting easily without the undercurrent of suspicion. We learned to laugh without hesitation, to share silence without fear that unspoken words would erupt into battles. In those moments, I realized how much weight had been pressing on us for years, disguised as normalcy, until it finally lifted. My son grew into the new rhythm faster than I expected. At first, he kept to himself more, carrying the ache of disappointment in his mother like a shadow, but slowly he began to talk, not about her, but about himself. He asked questions about independence, about saving money, about what mistakes to avoid when living on his own. He wanted to know how to cook simple meals, how to fix a tire, how to manage bills. And each time I answered, I saw in his eyes a trust that had deepened, a bond that her betrayal had inadvertently strengthened between us. He no longer saw me as just a parent. He saw me as the steady ground beneath his feet. The divorce proceedings moved forward like clockwork, methodical and unyielding. Each session with the attorney was another step in carving away what no longer belonged to either of us together. She contested details, of course, furniture, accounts, even trivial items that held no real value except as bargaining chips. But her arguments rang hollow when faced with documentation, and each denial collapsed under the evidence. She began showing up late, her once sharp appearance dulled, her voice carrying less conviction. Even her lawyer seemed weary of defending her. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The process itself was the final act of dismantling the illusion she had built. Friends who had once been hers alone began to cross the invisible line, checking in on me, inviting me to gatherings where she was not included. Some did it out of loyalty to the truth, others out of discomfort with her choices, but the effect was the same. My circle widened while hers shrank. I found myself surrounded not by pity, but by respect. People saw that I hadn't lashed out wildly or dragged anyone into mudslinging. I had stood firm, quiet, deliberate, and in doing so I had allowed the truth to carry its own weight. That kind of dignity, I learned, attracts allies without you needing to ask. She, meanwhile, drifted further into isolation. Rumors reached me of her struggling at work, of friendships thinning, of strained conversations with her family. She tried once to stage a reconciliation dinner with our son, arriving with gifts and apologies, but he told me afterward that it felt rehearsed, as though she were reading lines from a play that had already closed. He thanked her for the effort, but didn't let it draw him back in. Watching him handle her with maturity beyond his years filled me with both pride and sorrow. Pride that he had learned resilience, sorrow that he had been forced to learn it so young. For myself, I began to rediscover pieces of life I had forgotten. I took long walks in the evenings, not to escape tension, but to enjoy the quiet rhythm of my own steps. I reopened old hobbies, books gathering dust, projects left unfinished. Even the small act of rearranging the living room felt like reclaiming space, declaring that this was no longer a house of secrets, but a home of honesty. Revenge had given me closure, but what followed was even more important. The ability to live without the constant shadow of betrayal. Still, there were moments when memory clawed its way back. I'd pass the auditorium where she whispered her announcement into my ear, and the sting would rise fresh again. Or I'd see a couple laughing at a restaurant, and for a fleeting moment, I'd remember the way she once looked at me before the lies. But those memories no longer held power. They were reminders, not anchors. They reminded me that love without respect is hollow, that trust broken cannot be glued back together without cracks. And they reminded me that revenge, when measured and precise, doesn't just punish, it liberates. As my son prepared to leave for college, We stood together in his room surrounded by boxes and half-packed bags. He turned to me and said, "I know this isn't how you wanted things to go, but I'm glad I got to see who you really are. You didn't just talk about strength, you showed it." His words landed deeper than any court victory or whispered rumor about her. Because in the end, this had always been about him. About making sure the day she tried to break me at his graduation didn't become the day he lost faith in me. That was the revenge she could never erase. He saw me, not her, as the anchor when everything else fell apart. Move-in day at the college came with that peculiar mix of chaos and tenderness that turns even the most practical conversations into small ceremonies. Because while carts rattled down hallways and parents argued gently over bed placement, I felt the hinge of our lives swing fully open, and when my son looked over the mountain of boxes and said, with a smile that had learned how to survive sorrow, that he was ready, I realized the story I had been carrying since the auditorium was finally approaching its last page. We hauled bins and books and an awkwardly large lamp up 3 flights, laughing when the elevator refused to cooperate. And when his roommate's family arrived, we folded naturally into the busy rhythm of introductions and duct tape and command hooks, until the room began to look like a place where a young man could actually begin a life without ghosts sitting in the corners. She appeared near afternoon, late enough to miss the hard labor, holding a gift bag and the kind of bright, almost brittle cheer she had been rehearsing for months, and she launched into compliments about the campus and stories about her own dorm days that didn't quite match the truth. Yet no one corrected her, because the air was fragile and the day belonged to him, not to old wars. There was a small reception in the courtyard, parents standing with paper cups of lemonade, new students tugging at lanyards, the dean making a gracious speech about independence and responsibility. And when the microphone passed to families for short goodbyes, I felt a quiet certainty rise. Not the urge to perform, but the need to seal what we had fought to protect. I stepped forward without flourish, thanked the staff, and spoke briefly about a promise made years ago at a kitchen table with savings jars and a battered notepad. A promise that college would not be a question mark because love had planned for it. And then I mentioned, with steady clarity that carried no sting, that when promises bend they must be straightened, and that accountability, handled calmly, can return what was taken. I said we had established a small scholarship in our son's name. Not grand, not theatrical, but real, funded by a restitution payment the court had ordered and matched by his grandparents, created to help another student each year who might otherwise teeter on the edge between yes and no. I didn't say her name. I didn't list the receipts. I didn't show the folder. I only thanked the people who had insisted that truth mattered. And I looked at my son and told him that even broken roads can be paved into something useful if you refuse to abandon them. That was the moment she erupted, because the applause that rose was warm and unforced and none of it belonged to her. And she lunged toward the folding table with a fury that had been simmering since the restaurant, her voice climbing over the clatter of cups as she accused me of weaponizing generosity, of crafting a spectacle to paint her as a villain, of turning our private grief into a public display. And she kept going long after the point had been made, her words tumbling over themselves, raw and breathless, while the dean froze and the parents exchanged the kind of glances people use when they are witnessing someone tear the costume off their own illusion. I did not answer. I did not move. I let the silence she feared expand around her until she heard what it sounded like to shout into a room that refused to validate the story she wanted to sell. And when she realized there was no rescue, she stepped back with a trembling gasp that sounded almost like a sob, then spun on her heel and fled the courtyard with a handful of shocked faces turning to follow the trail she left behind. My son stood beside me, his eyes steady, and he exhaled a long breath he had been holding since June, then whispered that it was enough, because he understood now that restraint can be louder than rage, and that some endings are not explosions but doors finally closing against the wind. We finished the afternoon with the small tasks that remain after a storm passes, labeling a drawer, taping a schedule to the wall, buying 2 mini snacks from the campus store. And when it came time to go, he hugged me with a strength that said more than any speech, telling me in a long, unbroken murmur that he would call, that he felt ready, that he knew who had kept the ground beneath him solid when everything else tilted. The drive home was quieter than I expected. Not hollow, but full of the kind of peace that comes when a blade has finished its arc and you no longer need to grip it. And the house greeted me with evening light pooling on the floorboards and the soft hum of a refrigerator that had been faithful through every season. I poured water, set the glass on the table, and opened the drawer where the folder still lived, then closed it again without touching a single page, because those documents had served their purpose and I didn't need them to remind me of what I had learned, which was that dignity is not an inheritance but a practice, and that revenge, when done with patience and care, is not a detonation but a calibration that returns the needle to true north. Later, on the porch, the summer air held the faint scent of cut grass and charcoal from some neighbor's grill, and I thought about that first whisper in the auditorium, the knife-edge glee with which she tried to carve humiliation into the center of our son's milestone, and I felt no urge to rewrite the memory or to salt it with speeches I never gave, because the ending had already corrected the beginning. The day she tried to make me small turned out to be the start of me stepping fully into my height, and the day she screamed at a thoughtful announcement meant for our boy's future became the last echo of a performance only she still wanted to stage. I didn't feel noble, and I didn't feel vindictive. I felt finished. The plan had worked because it had never been about destroying her, only about refusing to be destroyed, and the satisfaction was not the sound of her retreat but the steady, ordinary rhythm that returned afterward, the clink of a spoon against a mug, the creak of the stair, the calendar with new dates that belonged to no one's agenda but my own. When people ask, in the quiet way people ask when they want to know if revenge was worth it, I don't offer aphorisms or warnings. I say that telling the truth with patience can be a kind of mercy even when it hurts, and that I am not proud of the pain, but I am proud of the line I drew, and that our son knows exactly where to stand when the wind rises, which is beside the person who stayed, not the echo that left.